China wants to make the country's Uyghurs, a predominantly Muslim ethnic group, more subservient to the Communist Party. It has detained up to 1 million people in what it calls re-education camps, drawing condemnation from human rights groups and the threat of sanctions from the Trump administration. Loading collecting genetic material is a key part of China's campaign, according to human rights groups and Uyghur activists. They say a comprehensive DNA database could be used to chase down any Uyghurs who resist conforming to the campaign. Police forces in the U.S. and elsewhere use genetic material from family members to find suspects and solve crimes. Chinese officials, who are building a broad nationwide database of DNA samples, have cited the crime-fighting benefits of China's own genetic studies. To bolster their DNA capabilities, scientists affiliated with China's police used equipment made by Thermo Fisher, a Massachusetts company. For comparison with Uyghur DNA, they also relied on genetic material from people around the world that was provided by Kenneth Kidd, a prominent Yale University geneticist. On Wednesday, Thermo Fisher said it would no longer sell its equipment in Xinjiang, the part of China where the campaign to track Uyghurs is mostly taking place. The company said separately in an earlier statement to the New York Times that it was working with U.S. officials to figure out how its technology was being used. Kidd said he had been unaware of how his material and know-how were being used. He said he believed Chinese scientists were acting within scientific norms that require informed consent by DNA donors. China's campaign poses a direct challenge to the scientific community and the way it makes cutting-edge knowledge publicly available. The campaign relies in part on public DNA databases and commercial technology, much of it made or managed in the United States. In turn, Chinese scientists have contributed Uyghur DNA samples to a global database, potentially violating scientific norms of consent. Cooperation from the global scientific community legitimizes this type of genetic surveillance, said Mark Munster-Helm, an assistant professor at the University of Windsor in Ontario who has closely tracked the use of American technology in Xinjiang. Market in Kashgar, a city in the Xinjiang region of China. Uyghurs are under constant surveillance wherever they go in Xinjiang. Credit: The New York Times. In Xinjiang, in northwestern China, the program was known as Physicals for All. From 2016-17, nearly 36 million people took part in it, according to Xinhua, China's official news agency. Officials collected DNA samples, images of irises and other personal data, according to Uyghurs and human rights groups. It is unclear whether some residents participated more than once. Xinjiang had a population of about 24.5 million. In a statement, the Xinjiang government denied it collected DNA samples as part of the free medical checkups. It said the DNA machines that were bought by Xinjiang officials were for internal use. China has for decades maintained an iron grip in Xinjiang. In recent years, it has blamed Uyghurs for a series of terrorist attacks in Xinjiang and elsewhere in China, including a 2013 incident in which a driver struck 2 people in Tiananmen Square in Beijing. In Adelaide, a 5-year-old boy views photos of relatives that have gone missing or are in Uyghur internment camps. Alex Ellinghausen. In late 2016, the Communist Party embarked on a campaign to turn the Uyghurs and other largely Muslim minority groups into loyal supporters. The government locked up hundreds of thousands of them in what it called job training camps, touted as a way to escape poverty, backwardness and radical Islam. They also began to take DNA samples. In at least some of the cases, people didn't give up their genetic material voluntarily. To mobilize Uyghurs for the free medical checkups, police and local cadres called or sent them text messages, telling them the checkups were required, according to Uyghurs interviewed by Times. There was a pretty strong coercive element to it, said Darren Byler, an anthropologist at the University of Washington who studies the plight of the Uyghurs. They had no choice. Kidd first visited China in 1981 and remained curious about the country. So when he received an invitation in 2010 for an expenses-paid trip to visit Beijing, he said yes. Kidd, 77, is a major figure in the genetics field. The Yale professor has helped to make DNA evidence more acceptable in U.S. courts. His Chinese hosts had their own background in law enforcement. They were scientists from the Ministry of Public Security, essentially, China's police. Uyghur men stopped their bus on the roadside to prey on a highway leading into Hotan in Xinjiang. Credit. Sangili. During that trip, Kidd met Li Taixia, the chief forensic physician of the ministry's Institute of Forensic Science. The relationship deepened. In December 2014, Li arrived at Kidd's lab for an 11-month stint. She took some DNA samples back to China. I had thought we were sharing samples for collaborative research, Kidd said. Kidd's data became part of China's DNA drive. In 2014, ministry researchers published a paper describing a way for scientists to tell one ethnic group from another. It cited, as an example, the ability to distinguish Uyghurs from Indians. The authors said they used 40 DNA samples taken from Uyghurs in China and samples from other ethnic groups from Kidd's Yale lab. They also used samples from the 1000 Genomes Project, a public catalog of genes from around the world. Paul Fletchek, member of the steering committee of the 1000 Genomes Project, said its data was unrestricted and that there is no obvious problem if it was being used as a way to determine where a DNA sample came from. The data flow also went the other way. Chinese government researchers contributed the data of 2,143 Uyghurs to the Allele Frequency Database, an online search platform run by Kidd that was partly funded by the U.S. Department of Justice until 2018. The database, known as Alfred, contains DNA data from more than 700 populations around the world. An elderly Uyghur man in front of Kashgar's ID.com mosque in Xinjiang, China. Credit. Sangilu. This sharing of data could violate scientific norms of informed consent because it is not clear whether the Uyghurs volunteered their DNA samples to Chinese authorities, said Arthur Kaplan, founding head of the Division of Medical Ethics at New York University's School of Medicine. He said that, no one should be in a database without express consent. Honestly, there's been a kind of naivete on the part of American scientists presuming that other people will follow the same rules and standards wherever they come from, Kaplan said. Kidd said he was not particularly happy that the ministry had cited him in its patents, saying his data shouldn't be used in ways that could allow people or institutions to potentially profit from it. If Chinese officials use data they got from their earlier collaborations with him, he added, there is little he can do to stop them. Kidd also said he considered his collaboration with the ministry to be no different from his work with police and forensics labs elsewhere. He said governments should have access to data about minorities, not just the dominant ethnic group, to have an accurate picture of the whole population. As for the consent issue, he said the burden of meeting that standard lay with Chinese researchers, though he said reports about what Uyghurs are subjected to in China raised some difficult questions. I would assume they had appropriate informed consent on the samples, he said, though I must say what I've been hearing in the news recently about the treatment of the Uyghurs raises concerns. In 2015, Kidd and Bu Dowell spoke at a genomics conference in the Chinese city of Xi'an. It was underwritten in part by Thermo Fisher, a company that has come under intense criticism for its equipment sales in China, and Illumina, a San Diego company that makes gene sequencing instruments. Illumina did not respond to requests for comment. China is ramping up spending on healthcare and research. The Chinese market for gene sequencing equipment and other technologies was worth $1 billion in 2017 and could more than double in 5 years, according to CCID Consulting, a research firm. But the Chinese market is loosely regulated, and it isn't always clear where the equipment goes or to what uses it is put. In February 2013, 6 ministry researchers credited Thermo Fisher's Applied Biosystems brand, as well as other companies, with helping to analyze the DNA samples of Han, Uyghur and Tibetan people in China, according to a patent filing. The researchers said understanding how to differentiate between such DNA samples was necessary for fighting terrorism, because these cases were becoming more difficult to crack. The researchers said they had obtained 95 Uyghur DNA samples, some of which were given to them by police. Other samples were provided by Uyghurs voluntarily, they said. Tahir Hamid, an Uyghur whose blood was taken by police in Xinjiang, at his home in Virginia. Credit: The New York Times. China's tracking campaign unnerved people like Tahir Hamid. In May 2017, police in the city of Urumqi in Xinjiang drew the 49-year-old Uyghur's blood, took his fingerprints, recorded his voice and took a scan of his face. He was called back a month later for what he was told was a free health check at a local clinic. Hamid, a filmmaker who is now living in Virginia, said he saw between 20 and 40 Uyghurs in line. He said it was absurd to think that such frightened people had consented to submit their DNA. No one in this situation, not under this much pressure and facing such personal danger, would agree to give their blood samples for research, Hamid said. It's just inconceivable. The New York Times. Human rights in Asa religion security.